Hey everyone, and welcome to Scary Tales. Tonight, I've got some chilling new house horror stories for you to help you relax and drift off to sleep. But before you get too comfy, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. Now, let's dive into the stories. Story number 1. A few years ago, my wife Emily and I moved out of the city and into the suburbs. We had just welcomed our third child, and between the baby gear, scattered toys, and general chaos, our small apartment felt suffocating. The new house we found was a dream come true. A quiet neighborhood, friendly neighbors, and a backyard big enough for the kids to play. It wasn't massive, but compared to the cramped space we'd left behind, it felt like a palace. One of the features that caught Emily's eye was the garden. Overgrown, yet beautiful, it was filled with wildflowers, thick bushes, and scattered stone statues. Some were angels, others medieval figures, and a couple were too abstract to identify. They were weathered, their features smoothed by time, giving them an eerie charm. Emily loved them, saying they gave the yard character. I wasn't as enchanted. I thought they looked strange, almost otherworldly, but I didn't argue. If they made her happy, they could stay. Besides, moving them would have been a hassle, and I wasn't about to volunteer for extra work. A few days after we moved in, I was standing by the kitchen window, taking in the view of the garden. The golden light of early evening bathed the yard, casting long shadows across the grass. But something caught my eye. One of the statues, an angel, was facing away from the house. I was almost certain it had been facing toward us when we first arrived. I shook it off, assuming I'd misremembered, but the next morning, another statue had turned. This time I knew I wasn't imagining things. At first I thought maybe Jimmy, our 10-year-old son, was playing a prank. He was always up to something, roping his younger siblings into mischief. When I confronted him, though, he just furrowed his brow. "Dad, I didn't touch them," he insisted. "Why would I? They're creepy." Emily laughed it off when I mentioned it. "Maybe the previous owners arranged them that way," she said, shrugging. "You're overthinking." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. For the next few days, I kept a close eye on the garden. Nothing happened. Until one evening when I glanced out the window and froze. Every single statue had shifted. They now stood in a perfect row at the very edge of the yard, all facing the house. My heart raced. The air felt heavy, oppressive. My breath hitched as I stared at them, unable to look away. There was something deeply unsettling about it. Something unnatural. I could almost feel the weight of their stone eyes boring into me. Summoning my courage, I stepped outside. The scent of damp earth filled my nose as I approached the statues. I reached out to touch one, running my fingers along its rough surface. It was cold, unyielding, and impossibly heavy. Too heavy for one person to move alone. Too heavy for a child. I turned back toward the house, intending to call Emily outside, but she appeared at the door before I could. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. She had seen them, too. "They must be messing with us," she said finally, her voice shaky. "Maybe some of the neighbors are playing a prank." But that explanation didn't sit right with me. We'd met all the neighbors. They seemed normal, friendly people. And why would anyone target a family with young children? This wasn't a harmless joke. It felt like harassment. We called the police, but without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested installing security cameras, but money was tight. I promised we'd look into it, but inside, I was reluctant to spend what little savings we had. The next few days passed uneventfully, and I began to relax. Maybe the presence of the police had scared whoever was responsible away. Emily, however, remained uneasy. She avoided going outside after dark and kept the kids indoors once the sun set. I tried to reassure her, but deep down, I shared her unease. Then, one morning, everything changed. I walked outside to play with the kids, and as soon as I stepped into the yard, I saw it. Spray painted in thick black letters on the back wall of our house were 2 words: "Go away." I nearly dropped my son. Without thinking, I grabbed the kids and rushed them inside. My wife's face turned pale when she saw what had happened. Rage surged through me, hot and uncontrollable. I stormed through the garden, yelling into the trees, "You think this is funny? Show yourselves." Silence answered me. No footprints, no signs of anyone. Just the spray-painted message glaring back at us. The police came again, took photos, and gave us the same useless advice. Probably just local kids. But I knew better. This wasn't vandalism. It was a threat. Someone wanted us out. That night, Emily screamed. I ran to the living room and followed her shaking hand to the window. My breath caught in my throat. There were 5 people in our backyard. They wore plain clothes, but each one's face was concealed behind a smooth white mask. Their movements were slow, jerky, almost mechanical, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. They swayed in unison, their heads tilting unnaturally as if listening or watching. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed the biggest knife from the kitchen and yelled for Emily to call the police. Then, without thinking, I burst out the back door, screaming. The figures froze. For a heartbeat, we stared at each other. Then, in eerie unison, they turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness of the garden. By the time the police arrived, they were gone. No footprints, no evidence, nothing. The next day, I drained our savings to install security cameras. Money be damned. I needed answers. But after that night, the figures never returned. The statues never moved again. The messages stopped. For weeks, Emily begged me to let us move, but I convinced her to wait. Moving would have ruined us financially, and besides, nothing else happened. Life slowly returned to normal, or so I told myself. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up with a strange feeling, a heaviness in the air, a prickle at the back of my neck, like I'm being watched. And when I look out the window, toward the garden, I swear, just for a second, I see the statues standing closer than before. Story number 2. My wife Taylor and I recently moved out of our old home. She wasn't a fan of being so close to her family, so we decided it was time to put some distance between us and them. We didn't have kids, and she stopped working a while back, so she was pretty open to my suggestions on where we could go. I'm an electrician, so moving around wasn't an issue for me. After some searching, we found a great place in New Mexico. We've both been rural people our whole lives, so it wasn't a huge change. The house we found was pretty spacious, even though it was just the two of us and our black lab, Lola. But we figured we'd make use of the space, maybe host friends or just enjoy the extra room. We'd been settled in for a few months when I started noticing something strange. The upstairs lights kept tripping circuits, but the rest of the house stayed powered. I knew exactly what it was. As an electrician, this kind of thing was second nature to me. I figured it would be an easy fix, just rearranging the load on the breaker. Simple, right? After all, I've handled worse. I hadn't spent much time in the basement since we moved in. We checked it out when the realtor showed us the house, but I didn't really think much of it. One day, though, I figured I should check the breaker down there. The basement was pretty cluttered, more of a storage area than a usable space. After rooting around for a bit, I finally found the main breaker and noticed the issue. It wasn't too hard to fix, but I decided I'd deal with it later. As I was heading back upstairs, something caught my eye. In the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of old chairs, was a large metal door. It stood out because it wasn't like any other door I'd seen. It was industrial grade, tall and thick. Definitely not something you'd expect in a house like ours. My first thought was it might be a tornado shelter, but that seemed odd. You'd think the realtor would have mentioned it. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. So I went upstairs and started going through the keys the previous owners had left behind. After trying about 15 keys with no luck, I gave up for the moment. But I told Taylor about the door, and she was curious too. Somehow she managed to get in touch with the previous owners. That's when things took a strange turn. The owners were odd on the phone, pausing like they were trying to choose their words carefully. When I asked about the door, they got quiet. The wife eventually said it was just a safe room for tornadoes. But when I told her we couldn't open it, she said they'd lost the key. It didn't sit right with me. Why would they leave us keys to random doors, but not this one? The way she said it made my stomach turn. Taylor tried to brush it off, but I couldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, I kept going back to that door, wondering what could be inside. I tried every trick I knew, but the lock wouldn't budge. Finally, I decided to hire a locksmith. 2 days ago, the locksmith came over. After about 30 minutes, he came up to me, saying the lock was unusually complex for a simple panic room. That worried me. But after another half hour, he cracked it. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The room was set up like a shrine. Old black and white photos covered the walls, all with strange symbols I didn't recognize. In the center of the room was a chair, positioned to face the wall, as if someone had spent a lot of time staring at it. In one corner was a cot, with crumpled blankets that smelled stale and moldy. But the worst part was the trash. Empty chip bags, crumpled water bottles. Someone had actually been living down there, and not too long ago. The realization hit me hard. I had no idea who it was, but I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. As I was trying to take it all in, I noticed a small door in the far corner of the room. It was hidden in the dim light, but I managed to open it. Behind it was a set of stairs leading to the cellar door, which I had never opened. In all the time we'd lived here, I had never even thought to check it. The shock of it all turned into terror. Someone had been living in my house. It didn't matter that I hadn't seen them. I knew now that things I'd thought were just weird coincidences, like small things going missing, had a much darker explanation. I tried calling the previous owners again, demanding answers, but they didn't pick up. I couldn't reach them. Taylor was freaked out, and I was too. That night, I barricaded the cellar door with heavy furniture and locked it shut with a chain. There was no way I was going to let anyone slip back in through that door. The police came and took a full report. They told us they'd try to get in touch with the previous owners, and they even contacted our realtor, who was just as horrified as we were. She promised to help in any way she could, but that night, things got worse. We heard a loud bang on the front door. Lola started barking like crazy. Taylor and I froze, staring at each other, not knowing what to do. After a few minutes, the banging stopped, but then we heard small rocks tapping against our bedroom window. Taylor begged me not to go look, but I was furious. I was preparing to confront whoever was out there. I grabbed a baseball bat from under the bed and pulled the curtains aside, but there was nothing. Just darkness. We thought it was over, but then, downstairs, I heard the sound of glass shattering. I rushed downstairs and saw two figures running away from the house. The kitchen window was completely shattered. I called the police, and they arrived soon after. They searched the house, the basement, and the storm room, but didn't find anyone. They thought the people who had been living in the basement were angry they were locked out and came back to scare us. I was furious. My wife has been a wreck since then. The police are still working on tracking down the previous owners, but we haven't heard from them. It's been 2 full days now. I think the squatters are gone, at least for now. But if I can't reach the previous owners soon, I have no idea what I'll do. I'm ready to defend my home, but I hope it doesn't come to that. Story number 3. When I bought my first house, I was only 27. It wasn't much, a small, modest place, but it was mine. I'd saved up for years, and the pride I felt when I finally had my own home was indescribable. But moving in, that was a whole different story. For the first time, I was completely on my own. I'd grown up in a busy house with 3 siblings, 2 dogs, and constant noise. My new home, though, it was so quiet. It felt eerie at times. Living alone was hard to adjust to, and I'll admit, I sometimes missed the noise of my family. Anyone who's gone from a full house to living by themselves will know what I mean. It's a strange kind of loneliness. One thing I loved about the house was the tiny balcony on the 2nd floor. I know, it wasn't much. It was barely big enough to stand on, and there was no way to fit a chair out there. But it became my escape. Most nights after work, I'd step out there, light up a cigarette, and clear my head. I hated the smell of smoke inside, so the little balcony became my perfect retreat. The house was on a standard street, with houses lining both sides. Behind me, the backyards were all shared, divided only by 10-foot fences. From my balcony, I could see over the neighbor's fence and into their yard. It was a quiet street, and after a few weeks, I'd met almost everyone, except for one person, the man who lived behind me. I never saw him, not once. There was always a light on in his bedroom at night, but I never heard any sounds coming from his yard. No kids playing, no dogs barking, nothing. It was like he didn't exist. I wondered if maybe he was an older man, but his house was also strangely quiet. The grass hadn't been mowed in ages, and the house looked run down. The paint was peeling, and the siding was scratched up. Still, curiosity got the best of me, and one Saturday, I decided to go introduce myself. I walked around the block to his house, expecting to knock on the door and meet him for a quick chat. But when I got there, I froze. The house looked abandoned. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and it was clear no one had taken care of it in years. The doorbell didn't work, so I knocked and waited. Nothing. Tommy. Just as I turned to leave, I saw a flicker behind the window shade. Someone was watching me. I froze. Then, without warning, the door flew open, slamming against the wall. I jumped back, my heart racing, and found myself face to face with an elderly woman. She was small, with gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her skin was wrinkled, but it looked tense, almost unnatural. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and she just stared at me. I didn't know what to do, but eventually I introduced myself as the new neighbor. She barely acknowledged me, just gave a half smile, and said her name was Priscilla. Then she just stood there. No small talk, no nice to meet you. It was awkward, and I quickly walked away, unsettled. I never heard the door close behind me, but I didn't want to turn around and risk looking back. That night, I went out to my balcony like usual. But when I looked over the railing, I saw her. Priscilla was standing in the middle of her yard, staring up at my house. She didn't move, didn't call out. She just stood there, still as a statue. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things or if it was real. I couldn't decide whether to wave, ignore her, or just go inside. I went back inside, trying to shake it off. Maybe she was just lonely, I told myself, but it didn't stop there. The next night, I saw her again, moving from window to window in her house, watching me. I tried to pretend I didn't notice, but deep down, I knew she knew I saw her. It was creepy, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't. A few nights passed, and I didn't see her at all. I started to feel better, thinking maybe I had been overreacting. But then, one morning I found a woman's sock in my yard, just sitting there by the fence. I couldn't shake the chill that ran through me. It wasn't just her strange behavior anymore. She had been on my property. That night, the doorbell rang and rang, over and over, at least a dozen times. I knew it was her. I was tired, irritated, and frankly, annoyed. I wasn't scared. I should have been, but I wasn't. I went to the door, thinking I'd just tell her to leave me alone once and for all. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The moment I opened the door, she lunged at me, full speed, kitchen knife in hand. Her face was twisted in rage, and she was screaming about how I had taken her son. I barely had time to react. I managed to grab her arm, wrestle the knife away, and pin her to the floor. I was shaking, my heart pounding, but I wasn't going to let go until the police arrived. She screamed the entire time, yelling about her son and how she was going to kill me. At one point, she even tried to bite me. I couldn't believe this was happening. When the police finally arrived, they had to physically drag her off me. She was still screaming, even after they shoved her into the squad car. The police told me she'd be sent to a psychiatric facility. They made sure I was okay and assured me she was harmless now. But I couldn't forget what had happened. The whole ordeal had shaken me to my core. I moved out less than a year later. I didn't feel safe there anymore. Looking back, I can't believe how naive I was. I still get chills thinking about it. Thanks for listening. Goodbye. And have a restful sleep.